Webinar organized by ASEAN Study Center at Faculty of Social and Political Science, Universitas Gadjah Mada. My name is Fadila Rahma, and I'm a program intern at ASEAN Study Center. I am here today to help assisting of today's webinar. Thank you everyone for attending. Our topic today is the new normal, community preparedness in ASEAN countries. And we have our special guest today as our main speaker. He is Kim Beng, or Pak Kim, founder and chairman of Eco Strategic Insight and former director of Political and Security Community Department at ASEAN Secretariat. Welcome, Pak Kim. We are very glad that you are here with us today. Before we start, I would like to inform to all the participants of today's webinar, if you have any questions that you want to address, you can send it directly to the comment sections in our YouTube's live stream. And don't forget to mention your name and where you're from. All right, to start our webinar, I would like to welcome Tunggul Wicaksono that will lead us to the introductions of our main guest speaker and also will bridge our discussion today. Tunggul is a researcher officer at the ASEAN Study Center, Universitas Gadjah Mada. He received a Master of Arts in International Relations degree in 2019. During his career as a researcher, he also works under the National Center for Research on Europe, University of Canterbury, to represent Indonesia, together with his academic partners from China, Japan, and South Korea. So, without further ado, Mas Tunggul, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fadila. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This event is brought to you by ASEAN Study Center. And for a glance information, the center is responsible to provide critical and objective assessment on various prominent issues surrounding ASEAN. The tagline of bringing ASEAN closer to you is the center's endeavor to bridge the ideas, spirit, and programs of ASEAN for the benefit of sciences development and policy formulation in Indonesia. You can follow up our social media in Instagram at ASCUGM, Facebook at ASEAN Study Center UGM, or visit our website at asc.visipol.ugm.ac.id. My name is Tunggul Wicaksono, and I am the research officer at the ASEAN Study Center. Today, we are presenting the new normal, community preparedness in ASEAN countries, presented by Honorable Speaker Kim Beng, or would you allow me to call you Babak Kim instead?
Kim will do.
Sure. Well, at this point, I would like to introduce our featured speaker so we can get into our content. Our guest is Kim Beng. Kim Beng is the founder and chairman of Eco Strategic Insight, an education and strategy consultancy at ecostrat.com. He was formerly a multiple award head tutor in history, politics, modern world economics, cultural revolution, and modern Chinese history at Harvard University. He received his first degree from International Islamic University with a Bachelor of Arts degrees in Political Science, with a major in International Relations and minor in Islamic Revealed Knowledge. His subsequent Master of Arts degree in International Peace Studies was from University of Notre Dame, United States, followed by a Master of Philosophy in International Relations at University of Cambridge. His PhD thesis was submitted to Meiji University in Japan. He has produced a book available on Amazon.com on Islamic State, a zero-sum game, and Maqasid Sharia under the label of Nordic Institute of Asian Studies in Copenhagen and Sigwarp Press. Prior to his role as an academician, Pak Kim was a professional journalist with Straits Times Singapore, based in Harvard University. He has also contributed extensively to South China Morning Post and Asahi Shimbun, and Pak Kim has his own book review at asiabookreviews.com. Okay, just a little housekeeping before we get started for the audience. We really would like to hear from you and would like to include your voice in the conversation. So if you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box in your StreamYard control panel or in your YouTube comment section. It should be located in your right side. And I will bring them up during the presentation, and we will also have time for the question and answer at the end. And now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Pak Kim to present or highlight the subject matter on our issue today on To focus our issue, how do ASEAN countries embrace and adopt the term new normal into their national policies? Pak Kim, the time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this invitation to speak to all your audience at University Gajah Mada or Gajah Mada University in Jogja. Well, first of all, I would like to say that the word new normal might seem very novel, very new. Um, but to a large degree, new normal is not something that is new at all. New normal is the word that governments, societies, perhaps civil society organizations like to use when they confront a new age or new time. So in the case of the the etymology, the root of new normal, if you look at uh, Google, even though Google is not a very objective measure of where the history of new normal emerged, you realize that new normal was a word that was introduced right after World War One, World War Two, uh, the end of Cold War, and the word new normal is also used by people like Roger McNamee, who is an investor. So, in other words, new normal can be used in a variety of contexts as long as the humanity or the world is confronting a new age. So that's the most important thing that everyone should remember and understand. New normal is actually not new. When governments in Indonesia or ASEAN are using the words new normal, what they really mean is they want to renormalize the previous economic and social activities that have kept them growing, that have kept them proceeding forward as a country, and of course as a region, because there is this vision to create a single ASEAN community by 2025. Now, once you understand that new normal is not something new, but something which the government would like to promote anyway, then you will begin to realize that new normal comes with a very definite political context. In other words, the government will explain certain things or new things, what is known as new SOP, Standard Operating Protocol, or Standard Operating Procedures, that every single individual in the public sector, in the private sector, uh, whether the person is young or old, uh, employed or unemployed, they would have to subscribe to. So within the context of uh, new normal, in that sense, that would include uh, washing your hands as regularly as you can, because the virus of COVID-19, which is the name of the virus, is actually referred to as SARS-CoV-2. Uh, and the reason is actually very simple, because SARS-CoV-2 originally came from, it's actually the cousin of the first SARS in 2002 and 2003 that went global and became a pandemic. So the new standard operating procedure right now would include hand hygienes, washing your hand regularly, making sure that you are 1 meter or 1.5 or at least 2 meter away from another person, wearing of a mask in order to prevent airborne transmission of the viral droplets. Because one of the most dangerous thing about SARS-CoV-2, which triggers the disease of COVID-19, is the fact that whenever anyone speaks too loud or whenever anyone coughs or sneezes, the viral droplets can transfer from human to human. But if you stay within a safe distance of 1 meter or 1.5 or 2 meter, then there is a strong or higher likelihood that the viral droplets will drop to the ground before it reaches your air passage, your eye, or even your mouth. So that's the reason why countries have been uh, urging everyone to put on a mask to protect yourself and to protect others from contracting uh, COVID-19. Now, on that note, uh, we that new normal is actually a new set of SOP, standard operating procedure, that everyone should embrace, accept. We should also understand that some of these SOP are actually based on the consensus of scientists or epidemiologists all over the world. Uh, so in other words, these standard operating procedures are based on the best guesses or best case practices of countries that have been exposed to SARS-CoV-2, some of which have managed to contain it, such as China, some of which are still struggling with the new normal, such as the United States and parts of Latin America, especially Brazil. So these are the basic practices that can be adopted in order to prevent a person or a group of a person from contracting SARS-CoV-2. So the dimension or the levels to understand the new normal or the new SOP is actually based on what a country would like to do. There is the level of the country, what the community should also be doing, and the county too. Um, to a large extent, the new normal may or may not be effective, depending on the mutation of the virus of SARS-CoV-2. If anyone is a specialist on the literature of SARS-CoV-2, the person would know that SARS-CoV-2 has mutated and changed. The virus has mutated and changed according to different geographical location, according to the differences in the immunity system of the individual, and also according to the history of the exposure. So the basic consensus is that SARS-CoV-2, which triggered COVID-19, began in the city of Wuhan in Hubei province, and it started right around December 1st or December 8th, 2019. So that's why it's known as COVID-19, because it's actually associated with the year when it began. But the most recent research has found that there were traces of the virus of SARS-CoV-2 in the feces of the sewer system in Barcelona. The scientists in University of Barcelona has discovered that the virus of SARS-CoV-2 in milder form can exist in the sewer system as early as March 2019. Now, incidentally, when during that period, March 2019, just prior to my admission into ASEAN Secretariat as the Director of Political and Security in ASEAN Secretariat, I made a video predicting that the world will face a pandemic across all continents. And the reason for that was because I could observe, based on my experience in researching on SARS, most of the viruses have become more and more vicious and difficult to contain. In fact, if you look at the history of the World Health Organization or the history of addressing pandemic, only smallpox has been totally eliminated. But there are a variety of diseases that haven't been eliminated completely at all through vaccination. So, for instance, you have um, right now we have SARS-CoV-2, where everyone is looking for a vaccine. We also have AIDS that has gone pandemic, and AIDS is not just a pandemic, but it is also something that is endemic. In other words, it is in the society all the time. So SARS-CoV-2, if we do not find the proper vaccine that can protect everyone at all ages, then we are potentially looking at the high possibility that the pandemic will become endemic. And that is the biggest risk. In other words, it will always be with us until the vaccine is found. Now, when it comes to the issue of a vaccine, there are about 100 to 300 research companies. Now, from the definition of World Health Organization, they are keeping track of 100 research institutes that are looking for a vaccine. But according to private estimates, that there are right now about 300 companies that are looking for a vaccine on SARS-CoV-2. The issue about vaccine is that 90%, this has been empirically proven, 90% of all the research on vaccine are bound to fail. So, for instance, you have Gates Foundation, founded by Bill Gates, who has funded 7 research institutes to find the vaccine, because Bill Gates understands that the likelihood of finding a vaccine will be very, very low out of that 7 research effort. So Bill Gates has put in about $2 to $3 billion from Gates Foundation to look for a vaccine, but he has also explained that the likelihood of finding a successful vaccine may happen between 12 to 18 months, but it also may not happen at all. So, and the research of vaccine shows that 90% of most efforts will fail. So on that basis, the new normal that ASEAN or any countries are adopting will be based on this realization that maybe we cannot find the vaccine at all, and therefore we have to live our lives based on permanent new standard operating procedure, such as I mentioned, keeping your clear of the next person whom you do not know or even whom you know. The reason why you have to keep clear or stand at least 1.5 to 2 meter is because of the nature of SARS-CoV-2. The carrier of SARS-CoV-2 would most likely be asymptomatic. In other words, the person can have the virus from day 1 to day 14, in some cases to day 37. So in other words, the virus will be in that person's body for 1 to 37 days, and that person will not show any signs of sickness, such as sneezing, coughing, shortness of breath, lethargy, lack of energy, that person will not show any of the sign. That's known as asymptomatic carrier. Precisely because the person whom you know or the person whom you do not know look perfectly healthy, uh, yet is able to transmit the virus to you uh, through droplets or by touching you, and then you accidentally touch your eye, your nose, and your mouth. Therefore, it is extremely important for everyone to pay attention to the latest scientific consensus. So the basic consensus that one shouldn't challenge, which unfortunately President Donald Trump in the United States has been challenging over the last 3 months, uh, is that there is no need to put on a mask. This is not dangerous. But as we can see from the numbers, this is a very dangerous infection. And United States now has the most number of cases around the world. Last night, or perhaps it was 2 nights ago, President Donald Trump finally conceded belatedly that he is now agreeable to people wearing masks, but that may come a little bit too late. So, in other words, even President Donald Trump in United States, who has been resisting the new normal, has finally conceded or surrendered to the empirical fact, that maybe the best way of containing the transmission or breaking the vector of transmission is based on the simplest procedure, which is the wearing of masks. So hopefully more and more Americans or more and more people who travel to the United States will start wearing a mask, uh, sanitize their hand with an alcohol content that is at least above 65 to 70%. And by resorting to those measure or new normal, then the case load might begin to drop. However, as I am speaking right now, it is very clear that the cases in the United States, all across the 50 states in the United States, uh, slowly and shockingly surging. And one of the reasons could have been due to uh, the participation of everyone in the movement to protest about the unfortunate death of George Floyd in the name of Black Lives Matter. So let me be very specific about uh, COVID-19 with regards to Indonesia. The case, the future in Indonesia is not completely hopeless, because your president has actually spoke of the importance of importing and buying medicine produced in Japan, which has been proven to be very effective. It's not a vaccine, but it is a very effective medicine known as Avigan. The scientific name is favipiravir. So if you Google the word Avigan or favipiravir, you will find that the scientific community has been very, very positive about the positive effects or the curative effects of Avigan or favipiravir. From what I can learn from Indonesia, the medical community in Indonesia, if Avigan is bought on a large scale and used on patients, there is a strong likelihood that uh, patients with mild symptoms can recover in about 4 days or a little bit more. This applies to people with mild symptoms. Now, Aside from Avigan, you also have the choice of experimenting with Tamiflu, produced by Pfizer, a pharmaceutical company in the United States. So, in other words, before you find a vaccine, not everyone infected with COVID-19 will necessarily uh, face the possibility of death. That person may first be asymptomatic, have mild symptoms, have moderate symptoms, and finally have severe symptoms where the person would have to be intubated because he or she can no longer breathe on his or her own, needing a ventilator, needing the service of the health frontliners, wearing very uh, precise personal protective gear such as goggles, layers of gloves, uh, hazmat suit to tend to the severe patient. Now, having said all of that, it is important to note that uh, when the outbreak started in Indonesia in February, uh, one of the ways in which Indonesia tried to handle the pandemic was by understanding what WHO, World Health Organization, was trying to prescribe. So they looked to WHO for guidance, and WHO explained that the key is based on a formula known as 3Ts. So that would be testing, tracing of the patients or people exposed to the carrier, and finally, treatment. Now, with regards to treatment, World Health Organization unfortunately was not very uh, far-sighted or scientifically correct on various forms of treatment. Uh, the World Health Organization prescribed hydroxychloroquine or chloroquine. It has been proven by the scientific or medical community last week that hydroxychloroquine actually increases your mortality rate by 1%. In other words, it makes you more vulnerable if a person uses hydroxychloroquine. And I think in the medical practices of Indonesia and many countries in ASEAN and also the world, hydroxychloroquine was one of the prescribed medication. Uh, but it has been proven that it doesn't work. In addition to that, in order to subscribe or conform to the new normals, the World Health Organization has also issued uh, some basic guidelines. For instance, if you want to reopen your society or your economy, uh, first of all, the number of cases uh, has flattened. The caseload has flattened. In other words, you have dealt with the first peak, even though there are more waves and more peaks to come. Secondly, you must be able to continue to have constant surveillance of your patients or your carriers, and be able to quarantine them accordingly. Thirdly, the government should be able to ensure proper and safe treatment without using any medications that are not proven. And finally, uh, the country that is about to adopt the new normal of reopening the economy or society must be able to um, communicate in a consistent, truthful, and clear manner, not just with WHO, but with any country that require public disclosure of those medical information, or you can call it the big data of SARS-CoV-2 that leads to COVID-19. So if your audience or your students or your faculty members would like to understand new normal, they should first accept the fact that what is new is actually old, in the sense that whenever humanity faces any existential crisis or crisis that are very shocking, with huge impact on the economy, on the society, the authorities of the society will always adopt the language of the strategic necessity of a new normal. That's the key concept that uh, your audience should understand. But once you understood that, you should understand that new normal is nothing more than renormalization of what you have been doing before. So on that basis, I think I've spoken uh, sufficiently on the subject, and I will allow uh, the moderator to take it from there. And I'm open to any questions from your audience. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation, Pak Kim. But before we enter the questions and answer session, Pak Kim, I was wondering about the fact that you have won your home country in Malaysia, right? Back then in March 2019, that you made a prediction that the possibility of the pandemic will be very high. And as it turns out, the outbreak eventually happened in December 2019. And how was the government's response regarding to your warning? Or do you think is it true that there's a gap between science and politics, that both fields will never meet in the middle ground under such circumstances, especially in this crisis situation? Do you think so, Pak Kim?
Uh, this is a very, very good question. And this is also a question that I've been asking myself over and over again, because I was the first uh, Asian political scientist to make that prediction in March 2019. If your audience were to look it up in my YouTube channel. And the reason why I made that prediction and put it on YouTube was because I could see that once I'm in ASEAN Secretariat, I will not be allowed to speak on pandemic, even though pandemic is a security issue that now affects ASEAN and the rest of the world. Now, why did my government not accept my prediction? The reason could well be due to the inability to understand how humanity has actually encroached into um, the world of nature or the animal kingdom. Because, in other words, you have to understand that SARS-CoV-2 is actually not a large-scale pandemic. It has happened before. 100 years ago, you have Spanish flu that killed between 50 million to 100 million around the world in 1919. And prior to Spanish flu, the plague or the Black Death has also happened in Europe in the 15th century. And of course, in places like China, India, they have faced those kind of pandemic before. But in the case of Malaysia, whenever we talk about diseases, we tend to isolate that diseases as something which we can contain or treat, such as malaria, dengue, HIV. So there is a big gap between understanding those mosquito-borne or sexually transmitted diseases to something that is actually a continuation from the original SARS in Hong Kong. So the decision makers, the highest decision makers in Malaysia, could not understand that a pandemic was coming because virus will constantly mutate. And according to the scientific community, there are about 1.5 to 1.6 million viruses in the world, even as we speak. And those are the viruses that we can find in the zoonotic or in the animal world. And in fact, we should not be confused that viruses only affect human beings. Some viruses affect the animals first. So there is one virus in the world that can actually eliminate most of the amphibious species. Now, what we as human beings would like to prevent is to first break the vector of transmission between animal to animal, and finally animal to secondarily animals to human beings, and finally humans to human. So there are three stages of transmission that we have to constantly look into. So unless a government understands pandemic in that form, it is extremely difficult for any authorities to acknowledge the danger that is posed by pandemic. So in the case of Vietnam, it's one of the largest country in Southeast Asia. The cases of COVID-19 have been very, very low, only in the hundreds, low hundreds. And the mortality rate is zero. In other words, no one in Vietnam has died of uh, SARS-CoV-2, which is very impressive.
Okay.
And Vietnam didn't follow what was prescribed by WHO, which was to test, trace, and treat. Vietnam only followed two protocols, which is to trace the carriers and also to try to treat all the patient as extensively as possible. So I hope that answers
Okay.
your question.
Well, thank you, Pak Kim. That was a very insightful information from you. Here it looks like we have a few questions. This is a question from Alifa Salsabila. She asked, Mr. Kim, how do you see the Vietnam success in handling the COVID-19 outbreak? Do you think their strategy of fighting the virus as if fighting against enemy can be applied throughout ASEAN community? Your answer, Pak Kim.
Thank you, Ms. Alifa. My response to that is, unless you are able to understand the mentality and the culture of the Vietnamese government, society, the people, a country cannot just adopt the Vietnamese method. Because, for instance, as I just mentioned, Vietnam has been very successful in containing COVID-19, and they do see the virus as a form of war and with an invisible enemy. And one of the reasons is also because Vietnam has a very uh, perilous or unstable relationship with China. So there's always something lurking at the back of their head. Maybe virus can be transformed into a bioweapon by its enemy, whether it's China or any radical group. Vietnam has always had that mentality. By virtue of that, Vietnam is the only country in Southeast Asia that has had a long history of working with University of Oxford's Center of Disease Control. So whatever Vietnam has succeeded in doing so far, in keeping COVID-19 down, in preventing any death, it definitely has a lot to do with the fact that there is a Center of Disease Control in University of Oxford in Ho Chi Minh City, and there's also another one uh, from University of Oxford in Hanoi. So the Vietnamese authorities have been wise enough to work with these foreign research institutions that have been constantly looking at all kinds of viruses, not just SARS or Middle East severe acute respiratory syndrome or SARS-CoV-2 or any kinds of virus, but uh, hundreds, if not thousands of viruses that can trigger human to human transmission. So if Indonesia would like to learn anything from Vietnam or from any country that has managed to contain COVID-19, one of the best steps forward is to find a medical research facility that can collaborate with Indonesia. So for instance, University of Gajah Mada can work with Stanford Bionics, which is closely related to Stanford University, because that institution is making a lot of medical advances in combating COVID-19. University Indonesia can also consider the prospect of joining with University of Gajah Mada to work with University of Oxford, or also the Genetic or Genome Research Institute in University of Cambridge, and potentially also the Harvard School of Public Health that is taking a very, very serious attitude on the pandemic. So once you have taken those steps to research on the issue, then when you announce the importance of the new normal, when anything goes wrong with your new normal, that forces you to try to close your society or your economy again, again, and again. In other words, Indonesia is facing a second, third, and fourth wave, if not constantly living with a pandemic that becomes endemic, then you always have a fallback option of relying on your local medical and research institution, as well as
Okay.
the help of international scientific institutions. So I hope that answers your
Okay.
question.
Okay, but Kim, let's dig deeper into that matter. You were suggesting that different countries have different characteristics to handle this pandemic, right? Are you suggesting that in terms of ASEAN countries, given the different landscape of the geographical and political situation, can you give us a brief characteristic between ASEAN countries about how to handle the virus? Are there any like the differentiation or different method to combat the virus itself?
First of all, even though the whole of Southeast Asia is represented by the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, and there is an ASEAN secretariat in Jakarta. Uh, Based on my experience, the rule of thumb is not to listen to any authorities in ASEAN Secretariat or even ASEAN Leaders Summit, because most of the decision makers, I would say 95% of decision makers, do not really know what is a pandemic, what is SARS-CoV-2 or COVID-19. They understand the danger, but they don't really understand the disease. For instance, SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA-based disease. Our human body has RNA and DNA. RNA is an information mechanism that tries to tell the DNA how to operate accordingly. So SARS-CoV-2 is an RNA-based disease, just like Ebola. And SARS-CoV-2 is a virus that goes into your body, stays in your system for 1 to 14 days, or perhaps 37 days in some extreme cases, and then explode and creates an immunity response that is not proportionate to treat to confronting the disease, creating what is known as a cytokine storm, where your T cells, which is one of the basis of your immunity system, went crazy and start attacking all forms of cells in your body. So if our region would like to come up with solutions that can help our country, community, so on and so forth, then we should have most of such dialogues, genuine dialogue, rather than issuing statements from the very top, uh, because I do not see how ASEAN can help the whole of the region just by releasing public statements.
Sure.
I hope I understand. I answered that question.
Yeah. Thank you for the insight, Pak Kim. Let's move on to the next question. The second question is coming from Fadilah Ristianti. Pak Kim, is it possible to have a mechanism that can be implemented regionally in ASEAN to tackle the issue? Your answer, Pak Kim.
Thank you, Ms. Fadila. My answer to that is, if we use ASEAN or the mechanism available in ASEAN leaders, provided by ASEAN Leaders Summit, it's not possible to have a region-wide solution, because one, the virus will change according to the different pathway of transmission. So for instance, Myanmar will have a form of virus that is less fatal. Perhaps that is the case in Vietnam right now. They have a mutation or a virus that is not very deadly, nor is it very infectious. So when countries feel that they have already handled the issue very well, I do not think that they would like to listen to the rest of the ASEAN countries on how they would uh, confront COVID-19. But having said that, in the case of Malaysia, the health authorities in Malaysia feel that they can end the vector of transmission based on random testing of vulnerable population. So in this case, our foreign workers are very vulnerable, and we have about 6.7 to 8 million foreign workers who live in potentially unhygienic condition. So we try to randomly test them, and when we find any clusters of outbreak, we will then try to isolate and quarantine them. So that's one solution. In the case of Singapore, Singapore has began the process of testing all their foreign workers on a daily basis. And they have about 320,000 foreign workers, which is why the cases in Singapore have crossed 45,000 to date. And they will use their resources and best medical treatment to deal with COVID-19. So on that note, I think that the region is not united enough to adopt a single solution. They might be very united in their rhetoric, in the way they speak. For instance, we have to fight pandemic like a war. We have to face it with a lot of resilience. But when it comes to implementation, uh, it will be different from one country to the other because each country has a different political system. They have different levels of resources on public health. Some are extremely well endowed, such as Singapore, but some are not, such as Cambodia and Laos, and therefore it is extremely difficult for ASEAN to have a common mechanism unless ASEAN is willing to put their words to where the money is. They come up with a COVID-19 fund, uh, such as the European COVID-19 bond, to try to collectively use their financial resources to help their economy to prevent further transmission of COVID-19 across the region. But so far, Southeast Asia has been very, very lucky because of the three strains. Originally, there were only two strains of coronavirus when it first happened, L strain and S strain. Now, scientists have discovered more and more substrains of the virus. Southeast Asia has been very lucky in the sense that our exposure to COVID-19 is infectious, but not as deadly as the ones that we see in the United States or in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, most of the patients are usually within the age of 25 to 50. So it's very unfortunate because Brazil is exposed to a strain of virus that is deadly to the most productive uh, demography of that country. Uh, so I hope I answer that question accordingly.
Sure. Thank you, Pak Kim. As you said earlier, that there are a slum area that has been a challenge for the states to handle the COVID-19 effectively. Let's talk about the vulnerable groups. Um, we have here the vulnerable groups that are most affected by the movement of supplies of medication, like they are daily wage workers, simply the urban poor, the elderly, or those who digitally unable to work from home. Do you have any thoughts about this? Because since the outbreak, it has become a challenge for us to handle the situation in the community or in the citizen of the countries itself.
The, the priority to addressing the issue which you just raised, which is patients that are or workers that are vulnerable, is to generate the most number of resources, financial resources. In other words, you have to come up with uh, public health funding to help them. So, for example, in the case of Singapore, you have poor people in Singapore too. And even though it's a rich country, but you about 80 to 85% of the Singaporean population are unable to afford the whole treatment of COVID-19 because the treatment, if you are warded in the intensive care unit, the whole treatment may cost 36,000 US dollars. So you have a lot of people in Singapore who cannot afford that. But luckily, they have medical insurance or public insurance from the Singapore government. But even if they uh, have that, uh, it's not completely free. Now, however, the Singapore government has been sufficiently generous and kind enough to try to subsidize the wages of the workers to for up to 75%, one of the highest in the region. So, in other words, Singapore would lock down for 3 months or more, and those workers who cannot go to work will continue to receive 75% of their wages, depending on their income bracket. So, in other words, it depends on how tenacious, how determined you want to be to generate the funds, the money to help the vulnerable groups of people. If a government or the society does not have that humanism to help as many people as they can, then the solution which I just suggested will not come to fruition. The vulnerable group will remain vulnerable and increasingly more vulnerable with or without the new normal. I hope I answered that question too.
Okay, thank you, Pak Kim. Let's move on to the next question. The third question is from Aika Grade Rebecca. The question is, if new normal is the only way out for the Indonesia, how should research institutes, specifically those working in the medical field, help specifically in implementing new normal measures? Your answer, Pak Kim?
Based on what I can understand from the Jakarta Post, because I haven't been back in Indonesia for the last 1 year, the new normal include the basic standard operating procedures prescribed by World Health Organization and the best case practices that Indonesia can glean or learn from the rest of the world. When it comes to uh, reinforcing the new normal in Indonesia to help Indonesia reopen its economy and society, a lot of it would have to depend on the social discipline of that individual. So, in other words, whether a person is a Muslim or non-Muslim or even an atheist, he or she should first exercise the inner discipline to maintain social distancing, to have the resilience to stay away from crowds or uh, entertainment centers. Because if a person does not have that kind of discipline, that person will be constantly exposed to the possibility of COVID-19. Uh, and by extension, if Indonesians do not believe that COVID-19 is a serious pandemic and one that is very infectious, and they keep coming out or insisting that they must pray in groups, the breakdown of that kind of discipline would not help the new normal at all, even if there are procedures, because some of the procedures are actually mm, not completely safe, such as walking through uh, a tunnel that sprays on you to clean or cleanse your body with some antiseptic material. Those are not actually uh, proven methods. It gives you a sense of false security that you are clean enough to enter that space, but it doesn't really eliminate the possibility uh, of you carrying the virus, spreading it to someone, or you catching it from someone. The moment you are in functioning in a society and you're not wearing masks or not social distancing and you're not using constant, resorting to constant hand hygienes, that's when you will constantly be exposed to those uh, those moments of vulnerability. So once again, I hope I answered the question of Ms. Aisha.
Thank you for your answer, Pak Kim. The next question is coming from Cesar. Cesar Negoro asked, in a community level, do you think that ASEAN has done enough in sharing best practices between members? Your answer, Pak Kim?
I think the gold standard of how to deal with pandemic was originally set by where it began by China. But then, as we can see, China used a very draconian method, a very strict authoritarian method of locking and closing down the entire Wuhan city and also 13 provinces that are next to Hubei. In the case of ASEAN, the gold standard originally was set by Singapore. They were able to conduct fast and mass testing. But it has been demonstrated by scientists lately. COVID-19 cannot be solved with one or two testing, no matter how accurate. You need to have regular testing, maybe every 2 weeks, uh, or perhaps allow family members to buy cheap and affordable self-testing kits to test themselves every few days, every week, depending on how much resources they have. So, has ASEAN done enough in sharing best practices between them? Not really, because ASEAN member states, including Singapore or especially Singapore, understand that not every country are as well prepared or well endowed or rich as they are. When I say rich, I refer to the Singapore government, not necessarily to all the Singapore individuals. Because as I mentioned, there is a huge income gap between the Singaporeans, between the rich and the poor. So I think there is still a long way to go for ASEAN to understand how to completely contain COVID-19. I hope that answered the questions of Caesar.
Okay. That was very insightful information from you, Pak Kim. We're moving on to the next question from Vida. Okay. This question is coming from Aicha. I'm sorry. This coming from Firman Alfansa. Hi, Encik Kim. What type of measures or cooperation do you suggest to be taken by ASEAN as a community to save the cross-border economy and protect public health at the same time during this pandemic? Pak Kim?
Let me read the question first. What type of measure of cooperation does one suggest to be taken by ASEAN as a community to save? I think I'm speaking to an audience who deeply believe in ASEAN or all the things that have been said about how Southeast Asia can function as one community by 2015. In other words, open borders, uh, common ability to face any threats coming from abroad. But my experience and my research has given me a completely new light. ASEAN is actually a very weak organization, very strong on rhetoric, but very weak in terms of responding to any emergency. So let's use the example of the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. It happened on a massive scale on the Indian Ocean side of Indonesia. Did ASEAN really respond speedily, promptly to the Indian Ocean tsunami in spite of the scale? Uh, Singapore tried to do its best. Malaysia also tried to extend some help, but all those help were not sustained over a long period of time to ensure that ASEAN is there to help those tsunami victims until they were able to restore their lives to a certain degree of normalcy. So ASEAN is not capable of handling any major crisis of significant and prolonged proportion. Now, in the case of Indian Ocean tsunami, the one country that immediately came to the aid of Indonesia was the United States when they sent the 7th Pacific Fleet from Hawaii to Indonesia to try to provide the victims in Aceh with all kinds of humanitarian relief and aid. ASEAN has a center known as AHA, ASEAN Humanitarian uh, Center. When it comes to helping the Rohingya refugees in ASEAN, for instance, not a single refugee has actually returned to Myanmar, even though you have the ASEAN Humanitarian Center or AHA or ASEAN Secretariat constantly claiming that they have done a lot to relieve the severity of the situation. So that's why I explained earlier, I am talking to a group of people who have strong belief in uh, the rhetoric of ASEAN. But my advice is always take the rhetoric of ASEAN with a pinch of salt. You don't have to disbelieve it completely, but you must be able to read beyond the headlines. So my think tank, Echo Strategic Insight, or my second company, Pan Indo-Pacific Arena, or what I call PIPA, which I just formed, are all think tanks that are meant to help people understand that they are facing a very dangerous century, not in terms of pandemic, but also in terms of uh, politics. Because between 2020 and 2024, the world will undergo many upheaval or disruptive events. For instance, the global economy has to function based on what I refer to as 4A, an economy that is strong in using algorithm, application, artificial intelligence, and automation. Indonesia has succeeded in some sense because you have Tokopedia, GoGrab, Bukalapak. These are some of your decacorn or unicorn. But Indonesia has a large population, and Indonesia has to do more in order to make its economy more consistent with the global trend, more consistent with what I refer to as the 4A. Yeah. Is there any more question?
Okay, thank you, Pak Kim. A friendly reminder for the audience. We would like to encourage you to ask the question to our speaker, Pak Kim. If you have any, please type in the comment section in your control panel. Okay, let's
Okay.
move to the next question. The next question is coming from Yulida. Yulida asked, the first question is whether the recent ASEAN summit has brought to light any meaningful steps in ensuring that we transit into the new normal with appropriate measures.
I don't mean
And the
to.
second question,
Hmm,
okay, please, your answer, Pak Kim.
okay. I don't mean to sound intellectually snobbish or arrogant, but my view is that whatever statements or vision statements that have come out of ASEAN Leaders Summit or ASEAN Virtual Summit on COVID-19, they can serve to remind the various leaders of the severity and danger of COVID-19, but they cannot provide any solution to reviving the regional economy because this pandemic will cause a global economic depression of about 5.2% next year, according to the World Bank. Uh, Allow me to correct myself. Originally, the World Bank predicted that the global economic depression will contract by 5.2, and recently they reassessed the situation and they realized that the global economy will contract by 5.8%. Now, given the fact that most of the economies in ASEAN are export driven in nature or based on tourism, um, or even natural resources like oil and LNG, these are the three sectors that have been heavily hit. The price of oil is extremely low, within the region of 30 to 35 US dollars, based on the price in West Texas Instrument. And it takes about $45 to produce a barrel of oil. So in other words, you are actually producing at a loss. So a country cannot uh, rely or lean on those carbon-based revenue to resuscitate or strengthen its economy. So if Indonesia especially wants to strengthen its economy to ensure that it doesn't depress by a huge percentage, then Indonesia has to think about the possibility of different phases of fiscal stimulus. So, for instance, Singapore has already launched 5 phases of fiscal stimulus, and even having done that, Singapore believes that they will contract their GDP will contract by 6% next year. So the finance minister or the president of Indonesia would have to think along those lines of how to increase the size and the regularity of the fiscal stimuluses. And if those cannot be done because you do not want to create unnecessary amount of debt, that's national debt, then maybe Indonesia would have to rely on uh, foreign assistance of key countries on humanitarian basis. I'm not suggesting that Indonesia resort to calling the International Monetary Fund for help. I'm not suggesting at all. But I am suggesting that Indonesia may want to ask the help of maybe Australia, New Zealand, potentially United States, that has a very close relationship with Indonesia, because United States and also European Union, they have the advantage of printing money. And when they do that, whatever they loan to Indonesia at certain point can also be forgiven as a national debt, as long as your relationship with them are constantly at a very impeccable level. So Indonesia should think in that paradigm. You don't have to go back to IMF, but you have to go to some countries that are willing to lend you some money to beef up your public health responses to purchase more testing equipment, personal protective gear, to increase the regularity of your testing. And from what I understand, Surabaya right now is the epicenter of a new outbreak in Indonesia. So perhaps all the resources that you can get from this country should be channeled to Surabaya first.
Let's move to the next question. Also coming from Yulida. Yulida,
The next question is, has COVID-19, in my opinion, brought ASEAN closer to China? Uh, my response is, I don't think so, because China has a very severe conflict with various claimant states in South China Sea. Unless that bone is removed from the throat, the relationship between ASEAN and China um, will be stable, but will not be uh, hunky dory, will not be pleasant forever. And in the case of Indonesia, as you can see, even though Indonesia does not have any conflict with China, territorial conflict with China, but Indonesia has a very strategic island known as the Natuna Island. And Natuna Island has the North Natuna Sea, which almost touch one of the 9 dash line of, mm, of China. And Indonesia recently has also acknowledged the United Nations Tribunal verdict on South China Sea that no country is allowed to use any historical basis to claim any maritime area. So on that basis, I do not think that COVID-19 has allowed China and ASEAN to be closer. I think the relationship will be based on mutual interest as and when we feel that we can make use of those relationships, we will do that. In other words, if we feel that China has uh, found has become the first country to find a new vaccine, then maybe ASEAN will draw closer to China at precisely that point. But if the United States is the first country to find the new vaccine, then the orientation of ASEAN will go towards the United States first, or to European Union. So uh, the answer to your question actually boils down to how fast, how quickly can we find a vaccine to deal with COVID-19? Because once the vaccine is miraculously found, then there is the issue of whether the population, the people in ASEAN, can immediately have access to those vaccines or not. Even if we speak of the health frontliners who should be prioritized, the issue still comes back to, do we have a good relationship with that country to have access to that vaccine as soon as possible?
this is the last question from the audience coming from Alifa Salsabila. She is interested in your statement about how ASEAN is working at the regional level. If there are many false dreams that she would say that ASEAN seems to promise to its community due to its very own characteristic, then how do you see the rhetoric ASEAN way can contribute, at the very least, in handling of the virus outbreak throughout this region?
Well, first and foremost, when you have a pandemic that might become endemic, in other words, a never-ending horror show, and you still do not have access to vaccine or even create your own vaccine nationally or regionally. What you want to be able to do is to adopt the new normal based on the standard operating procedures that I just mentioned. But beyond that, you also want to calm yourself down that the pandemic uh, is not something that will make lives permanently crazy for the whole population. So in that sense, ASEAN performs the role of being your reassuring auntie or uncle that everything will be fine. We will find the silver lining at the end of the tunnel. Uh, we will express solidarity to come up with solutions that can help all. Those will be useful rhetoric in some sense in reassuring the people. But realistically, uh, as you properly pointed out, those would also be a form of false security or false dream. So,
Okay.
in order to save yourself, you have to exert more effort to understand SARS-CoV-2, COVID-19, or potentially have more dialogue with more scientists and researchers or think tankers such as myself.
Okay. Uh, is that all your answer, Pak Kim?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Pak Kim, it looks like that we have covered all of our question. And do you, or is there anything else you wanted to cover before wrap up?
Um, so my conclusion to the whole session is that uh, we have to understand that this is not something that was uh, launched by any country because of a bioweapon program or any accidental leak from the lab. Uh, in fact, we don't know the origin or the first case of COVID-19. As I mentioned earlier, University of Barcelona has found traces of SARS-CoV-2 in the sewer system as early as March 2019 when I first made my prediction. And if the science go deeper, the source or the origin of pandemic could even be earlier. It could have been in milder form in 2018, in 2017. And in fact, one of the reasons why we call it SARS-CoV-2 is because it is the cousin of SARS in 2002 and 2003. It's just that SARS 2002, 2003, which we witnessed in Hong Kong and in various countries, has become extinct. But SARS of that period became the Middle East Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, or MESAS. And in a sense, it's uh, the irony of divine intervention because the Arab world, Middle East, understand the severity of any kind of uh, SARS-related pandemic. So United Arab Emirates have agreed to work with one of the research institute in China to find a vaccine as soon as possible. And one of the irony of a pandemic when a country is facing it is that the sooner you try to contain it, the more you will find that you are unable to find various spectrum of patients or carriers that can allow you to test on your own countrymen. So China right now has already contained COVID-19, but they know that SARS-CoV-2 is still mutating in different forms at different speed. In fact, SARS-CoV-2's mutation is 100 times the speed of SARS in Hong Kong. So that's a very uh, calamitous scenario. So China has to practically go to different countries to try to find different kind of patients to improvise their research on vaccine. They just cannot find a vaccine based on the patients or the 80,000 people that were infected in China. You have to try to find your caseload, your patients from those in European Union, from those in United States. But unfortunately, China does not have a good relationship with United States. Therefore, China cannot ask for any permission to try to draw the blood or the samples, the saliva samples of the patients in United States.
Okay.
China does not have a good relationship with
Okay.
Brazil right now. Yeah.
Okay. Is that all, Pak Kim?
That's all.
Great. Thank you, Pak Kim. Now, I would like to highlight some essential parts of our discussion today. To sum
Sure.
up, this is our final remarks for today's discussion. The new normal in ASEAN countries explores ways in which the COVID-19 pandemic might shape or reorder the world across the multiple dimensions. The first one is the new normal is actually not new, as Pak Kim Bang has said, that it has happened alongside the human history. It is the government initiative to promote as a standard operating procedure or SOP, both in public and private sector. In other words, citizens should embrace it. It is hard to measure the effectiveness of the policy since the virus keeps mutating and it is just a matter of time for the virus to infect more population. Second one, in Indonesia's context, President Joko Widodo has recently announced the new normal policy intended to reboot Indonesia's slumping economy, and it is being rolled out alongside the deliberate efforts to mislead and obscure the scale of the epidemic's risk. Um, One of the many experts have warned that a premature approach to the economic recovery could risk exposing Indonesian to further outbreaks and deeper, or maybe the longer term of economic disruption. If
Can I
the
intervene
reopening of the
Can I intervene very
uh,
quickly on the remark?
okay, sure,
I don't think that President Jokowi or any authorities in Indonesia are trying to mislead um, the country when they announce the new normal. What they are trying to do is try to renormalize the society. However, they have to understand that when they do that, they face the possibility of a second or third wave, such as
yeah,
Germany or United Kingdom.
yeah, yeah. I don't disagree. But if the renormalized intention initiative from the government is not supported by the measures to strengthen the healthcare system, it could lead to an explosion of infection. Is that right, Pak Kim?
Uh, it
Well,
could lead to,
nevertheless, the future of Indonesia is not fully hopeless.
you are right. The reason why I am an optimist on Indonesia, but not on the rest of the region, is because currently, based on what we see, the mutation of the SARS-CoV-2 is infectious but not deadly. So, in other words,
Yeah,
maybe a lot of Indonesians may get infected, but they can recover. And
yes.
the
Uh,
strain of the virus hasn't targeted uh, a significant, a very specific age population of the Indonesian people, unlike
yes.
what you see in Brazil.
Mm, okay. Also, when it comes to the issue of vaccines, more than 300 companies, including Bill Gates Foundation, as you have said
Yes.
before, are looking for the cure, and 90% of all research are scientifically proven. The likelihood of finding successful vaccine may happen in the next 5 months, but there is also a possibility of those are not succeed to cure the population. Is that right,
Uh,
Pak Kim?
Let me just intrude very kindly again. 90% of most vaccinal research will fail. 90%. So, in other words, if you have 300 companies that are involved in the research on vaccine, 270 companies are likely to fail, leaving only 30 companies that might succeed, which is not a lot because we are talking about a pandemic that can affect more than 7.5 billion people around the world.
Okay.
Aside
Uh,
from that, yeah, okay.
yeah. Okay. The last remarks from Pak Kim, that he was stressed about the importance to show transparency for public information, that every country has its own characteristic and different method to combat the virus. You are suggesting that we cannot use the one size fits all strategy, right, Pak Kim?
Yes.
Well,
Uh,
okay.
the
Do
reason
you
why
have
you
any
cannot, yeah, the reason why Indonesia cannot use a one size fits all strategy is because of the informal nature of Indonesian economy too. As you mentioned very earlier, there are many vulnerable groups who cannot work from home, who cannot be quarantined. So Indonesia or the 34 provinces that form Indonesia would have to come up with solution that befit those characteristics. But however, the standard operating procedures for the new normal, which I just mentioned, uh, would have to be embraced in the most minimal manner. But
okay?
if you try to use a method of China or South Korea, for instance, where they do regular and mass testing in the shortest period of time, uh, that is impossible for a country like Indonesia because you need huge amount of well-trained volunteers to take the saliva sample. You
Okay.
need huge number of medically qualified people to do the
Yes.
testing.
Yes. Uh, okay, Pak Kim. That is all the time we have for our webinar today. And I would like to personally to say thank you for Pak Kim, who gave a very insightful discussion today. The topic was timely, and you presented the material on the new innovation in a way that everyone could understand. And I personally gain more understanding now than I did before your presentation. Thank you for your very valuable experience. Thank you
Thank you
also for
to
ASEAN. Yes, thank you. Thank you also for ASEAN Study Center staff who initiate this webinar, Mbak Dida as our managing director, Ali and Akmal who manage the platform, Mbak Intan, Fadilah as master of ceremony, and Fakhri who helped to arrange this event. And on behalf of Akim as well as the team at ASEAN Study Center, thank you audiences for joining us and taking time to view our presentation. We appreciate you being here. My name is Tunggul Wicaksono. Have a great day and we will see you next time.
So yeah, thank you very much, Mas Tunggul, for moderating the sessions. And also, once again, thank you again for the very insightful discussions by Kim. I am sure there are a lot of key takeaways that we can learn from today's discussions. For all the participants, thank you for tuning in. Please stay tuned at our social media for our future discussions. And don't forget to subscribe our YouTube channels at ASEAN Study Center UGM and our Instagram at ASC UGM, because there will be more events to come in the futures. Once again, I hope you are all stay safe and healthy and see you in the next event. Goodbye and have a great day.